Welcome to the 5th CSIS GRIPS RSIS webinar. My name is Narushige Mitsushita. I teach International Security Affairs at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, based in Tokyo. This webinar is co-organized by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Indonesia, the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Japan, and the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS, in Singapore. This webinar is conducted in English, but Japanese interpretation is available. 日本語でお聞きになりたい方は、画面の下にありますインタープリターというボタンを押して、日本語を選んでください。途中でいつでも切り替えることができます。First of all, I would like to invite Professor Akihiko Tanaka, President of GRIPS, to make welcoming remarks. Professor Tanaka.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for GRIPS to host the 5th CSIS GRIPS RSIS webinar. On behalf of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar jointly organized by the 3 Centers of Policy Studies in Asia. We are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. In such a moment of great difficulties, however, ASEAN countries and its 5 partner countries, Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP, on November 15th last year. Although we are still struggling to overcome the pandemic, with the agreement of an important economic partnership agreement, East Asia could become more hopeful about the future of its economic recovery in the post-pandemic world. Last month, the IMF revised its predictions of world economic outlook. In a way, it becomes slightly more optimistic about the prospect of the world economy than in October estimates last year. IMF now predicts that the growth rate of the ASEAN 5, that is original members of the ASEAN, would be 5.2%. That of China, 8.1%, and that of Japan, 3.1% in 2021. These estimates indicate that the Indo-Pacific region continues to be the economic center of gravity in the post-pandemic world. And the RCEP will be an important institution in support of such Indo-Pacific dynamism. Today, we are extremely happy to have Professor Fukunari Kimura, Professor of Economics at Keio University and Chief Economist of the area, Jakarta, in our webinar. I don't need to make any detailed introduction of Professor Kimura, as he is widely known in East Asia as a leading economist with his analysis as well as many policy recommendations on the prospect of international economy in the region. We are also very happy to have Professor Jisuman Simanjuntak and Dr. Dipinder Landawa as discussants. On behalf of GRIPS, I would like to thank both CSIS and RSIS to realize such a wonderful panel for this webinar. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us look forward to a serious and interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tanaka. In November last year, 15 countries in East Asia and Oceania signed the RCEP, or Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, at the virtual ASEAN Summit hosted by Vietnam. We expect RCEP will play an important role in expanding trade and investment in East Asia and Oceania. In this webinar, we will discuss RCEP and other free trade agreements such as the CPTPP, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. How can we evaluate the utility of these new free trade agreements in terms of liberalization, rulemaking, reducing policy risks, and forming a pro-trade middle power coalition? Will the future be bright for regional economic integration in the Indo-Pacific region? To answer these questions, we have invited Professor Fukunari Kimura today. Professor Kimura is a specialist of international trade and development economics and has been working actively on the issues such as production networks, economic integration, and the digital economy in East Asia. Professor Kimura teaches economics at the Keio University and is also the chief economist at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, or AREA. We will ask Professor Kimura to speak for about 35 minutes. Professor Kimura, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for a very generous introduction. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to thank organizers for inviting me to this kind of a very important event. Let me share my screen first. Is it okay? I think so. Okay, so let's talk about the RCEP agreement this time. If we see a sort of a media coverage, we observe a sort of two extremes of the comments. First one is a very optimistic comment. RCEP is covering a huge amount of population and GDP. So this is the largest ever agreement. So this is great. This is one side of the coverage. The other side is that the quality is so low, so it doesn't make any progress in economic integration. So this is the other extreme comments. I think both are having partially a sort of a truth on RCEP, but not really get to the point in order to evaluate RCEP agreement. I think that how we can look at how should we look at Mega-FTAs? What's the roles of Mega-FTAs? I think this is a very important thing. And also, sometimes people say that just signing, ratifying, and also making in effect, and then that's it. But actually, that is not the final goal. How to utilize Mega-FTAs and how to develop that Mega-FTAs, that kind of aspect would be even more important. So I think from setting up that kind of starting point and then look at the RCEP, particularly in comparison with the CPTPP, that's basically I'd like to talk about today. So actually the role of Mega-FTAs are changing over time. They're starting from sort of two roles. One is a further liberalization must be promoted, and then international rulemaking should start from there. So those are sort of conventional roles of Mega-FTAs. As a background, actually we are having a so-called factory Asia. So the globalization is going on, but liberalization and rulemaking are not really catching up globalization. And so WTO has been a sort of slow in making a sort of progress in the liberalization and rulemaking. So that's why we have to utilize Mega-FTAs to promote those two objectives. So those are still very important, of course. And these two are two important criteria to look at the mega-FTAs. But actually, recently, new roles are added over there, I think. As a background, we have the weakening of a rule-based trading regime, and then we have US-China confrontation, and then COVID-19. So those are new phenomena in the past 4 or 5 years. Then actually we have to add two roles for mega-FTAs. One is to reduce policy uncertainties. Say the rule-based trading regime is weakening, so that's why we cannot really depend on the conventional common sense of international rules. Then sometimes countries are using trade policy for really short-run political objectives sometimes, and particularly in case of superpowers, nobody can stop that. So how we can reduce such policy uncertainties. This is one very important function. Another is to form a pro-trade middle power coalition. Again, say superpowers are not really following the rule-based trading regime, then how, of course, nobody can control them 100%, but what middle powers can do. I think this is another very important roles. So those two new roles are added for mega-FTAs. So in order to see and evaluate the mega-FTAs, I think those four objectives or roles of mega-FTAs would be very important. And also, mega-FTAs are not static, but should be dynamic. So we have to look at the evolving nature of mega-FTAs. So signing, ratifying, and being in effect are not the final goal. We have to think of the expansion of membership or deepening of commitments or utilizing as a communication channel. I think those are going to be more and more important when we talk about the mega-FTAs. So we have to look at mega-FTAs from those perspectives, I think. So I'd like to talk about the mega RCEP in comparison and with interaction with CPTPP. That's my talk that I'd like to talk about today. So first, I'd like to talk about the three challenges very briefly. We have to talk about those for much more in detail, but so today is a little bit brief. But the first one, the weakening of a rule-based trading regime. So the turmoil started particularly after that Mr. Trump came into the White House. Renegotiations of FTAs, say KORAS and NAFTA, that includes many elements of protectionism. So that in and out of the agreement itself, say some existing liberalization commitments are delayed, and also voluntary export restraints are imposed. And also the wages are coming into rules of origin, the connecting exchange rate manipulation issues to trade policy, and also so-called poison clause, say the Canada, Mexico cannot have a new FTA with non-market economies. Virtually. I think those are added in renegotiated FTAs. And then Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. This is a US domestic law allowing the government to impose trade protection based on security reasons. And I think this is obviously abused. Of course, say steel and aluminum related products having the tariffs, and on imports from some selected countries. So I think this is an obvious abuse of, at least it's not really consistent with our norm in the rule-based trading regime. Then Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act, this is to allow the government to impose some retaliatory action against unfair trade practices. So this is actually used for tariffs against China. So I think suddenly this is really directly violating WTO commitment or not. We have to go to dispute settlements in WTO and decide. But certainly those are not consistent with our norm or common sense in a rule-based trading regime. Then other countries are having retaliation or putting some countervailing measures or offsetting measures or safeguard measures. A part of them is also inconsistent with WTO policy discipline. So I think in both sides are actually weakening the rule-based trading regime. And then the continuously WTO is having difficulties. Say appellate body issue is one. So the US government is blocking the new appointments or extension of appointments of members of appellate body. Now members are 0. And also the weakening as a negotiating forum. This is not started right now, but that lasted for from the beginning. So those are situations. So certainly we have to think how to defend the rule-based trading regime. What Mega-FTAs can do is, of course, it's not a perfect job, cannot be done, but what can we do? I think this is one thing that we have to think of. The second, the US-China confrontation. So unfortunately, the US stance against China is likely to continue in Biden administration. Actually started from a tariff war. That was terrible, but that was relatively simplistic, but coming into a broader confrontation now. So actually the national security or sensitive technologies, the definition of those words is really expanded and a pretty ad hoc manner. And then we have starting from Huawei issues, then export control is strengthened, inward foreign direct investment regulations are strengthened, government procurement is limited to, some limitation is imposed for China or Chinese related companies, or even the clean network, excluding Chinese firms from production networks. These are coming in, TikTok and others. So those are really coming in. So actually from the middle powers in the middle, and we really have to watch very carefully how far economic decoupling would proceed. Certainly some are pretty optimistic because the US and China are having a very close economic relationship, and many US companies are making a lot of money in Chinese market. That's true, but at the same time, so national security or sensitive technologies arguments are very harsh in Washington, DC. These are having a bipartisan support. So cannot go back to a sort of nothing, zero situation. So in terms of industries, commodities, or farm nationalities, geographical extension, we have to see the boundary of decoupling, but we are not quite sure, actually. And also the Chinese diplomacy is also becoming very aggressive, not only against the US, but also other countries. So, you know, a sort of series of things with Australia and others. so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. And also Chinese side is introducing various kinds of export control and others. So I think from both sides now in the middle powers having some sort of pressure of the decoupling, not only from the US side, but also from China side possibly. So what the middle power can do, we would like to keep good economic relationships with both, because we have the really tight economic relationship with both the US and China. If we just look at the sort of economic aspects, we like to keep good relationship with both. But how can we avoid being forced to choose just one of them? So this is very difficult, but what Mega-FTAs can do, I think this is one thing that we have to talk about. And also decoupling will proceed. So how to reduce policy uncertainties. So this is again very difficult, but what Mega-FTAs can do. So those are things that we have to talk about. Third, COVID-19. We had a lot of confusion in news coverage, opinions, and others at the beginning. I think as Baldwin said at the really early days, that now we are having both supply shock and demand shock. But if you look at that very more carefully, then actually we have three kinds of shocks, particularly in the context of international production networks. One is negative supply shocks, initially coming from China in February, but in other countries having lockdowns and others. So this is negative supply shocks. But actually, that kind of shocks are relatively in short period. So people are worrying about the disruption of production networks or global value chains a lot. Some are saying in extreme that now this is the end of the era of global value chains. I think that was a terrible mistake. Actually, this is a really short-term temporary shocks. So particularly on the side of negative supply shocks. Then we have actually positive demand shocks partially. Say telework related things, people are staying at home, so do-it-yourself related goods, and also certainly medical related goods. We are having positive demand shocks. So we have actually the shortage of face masks and other things at the beginning. But actually those issues are pretty much solved now. So that was fortunate, of course. But again, this is not really permanent shocks. And we take care of that pretty much. Then negative demand shocks. This is a sort of common shocks once we have a sort of a worldwide crisis. So actually in each country, we have negative demand shocks due to lockdowns and prolonged social distancing. So I think we have to really look at three kinds of shocks. Then we can understand the nature of shocks, particularly in the context of international production networks. And actually, macro depression is huge. Particularly in North America and Europe, because they cannot move, actually. So the GDP drops are huge. But actually, the drops in international trade are smaller than that. And also, if we look at the financial sector and asset markets, those are surviving pretty well so far, probably due to unprecedented mitigation policies. So I think this is a big revolution of macroeconomic policy this time, so far at least. Actually, the production systems in East Asian international production networks have largely been intact so far. I think this is amazing. But if we look at the past crisis, then we observe this kind of robustness and resilience in international production networks. I just listed some papers over there. So basically, the machinery parts and components trade is much more robust and resilient compared with the other types of trade. So I think the private companies have optimized production networks in considering both cost saving, efficiency, and risk management. They are not dumb. They are pretty much prepared for a sort of various kinds of shocks. Of course, this time these are big shocks, but still they are really trying to optimize their production networks. However, of course, if negative demand shocks are prolonged, then that would hurt production networks. So we have to watch very carefully. So from these, one is a sort of concern, particularly for medical related goods, essential goods, concern on the collapse of international commercial policy discipline, particularly for medical and essential goods. So some people start worrying about. I think this has, of course, there's a good reason for thinking of that. This is one thing, of course, we have to talk about. And also to make production networks more robust and resilient. Then actually, we have to have more choices in location and operations of production networks. So actually, this kind of second unbundling or task by task international division of labor, only limited number of countries, only limited number of regions are doing this kind of operations. So if we have more room for expanding and deepening production networks, and then we would have more resilient, robust production networks. So in order to do that, the improvement of location advantages and also the reduction in service link costs, those are very, very still important in East Asia. This is just a picture of so-called fragmentation theory. So task by task division of labor. The important thing is a service link, because a task and each task is on production blocks. Those are separately located. So how to connect those, this is a very, very important. And actually some service links are very much relation specific. And in order to set up these kind of production networks, firms have to invest in a long-term perspective. So once they invest, they don't want to lose, even if some temporary interruption is coming. So I think this is a mechanism that why, say, production networks are more robust than other types of connections. This is just Japanese trade statistics. So HS 84, 85, 86, 89, 1992. These are machineries, basically, general machinery, electric machinery, transport equipment, precision machinery. We have export side, import side, parts and components, and final products. So you can see on import side, a big drop in February 2020. This is mostly due to China. So, but that is coming back very, very quickly. Then after that, the bottom is May, basically on the export side. This is a combination of the negative supply shocks in Japan and also negative demand shocks abroad. But that is coming back too. So I think in most of the countries, this is the Japanese figures, but in most of the countries, the bottom is actually May 2020. So we have to be careful, the prolonged negative demand shocks, of course, still. But actually the figures are really coming back with a bottom in May 2020. So production system is still there. So that was a pretty robust and resilient. So going back to Mega-FTA issue, so these are a series of Mega-FTAs done by Japan. Mainly I will talk about CPTPP and RCEP this time. But in between, Japan concluded EPA with EU, and also UK is really going out of EU. So actually Japan-UK EPA was in effect at the beginning of this year. And also Japan-US trade agreement, you see there's no word free trade agreement. This is a trade agreement. So this is sort of avoiding policy risks, obviously. So those are really coming in. But so we will talk about the CPTPP and RCEP from now. So going into the first criteria, first role, liberalization. So in market access portion, tariff removal is, say, compared to CPTPP, certainly this is low. In case of CPTPP tariff removal ratio, this is actually the number of tariff lines, number of items that would have a zero tariff at the end. So some tariffs are coming down very gradually. So, but that includes there. But in case of a CPTPP, tariff removal ratios are 99 to 100% for all countries except Japan. That's a big shame of Japan, I think. But so Japan is really retaining agricultural protection. So that's why Japan actually 85. But in other countries, 99 to 100%. Compared to that, RCEP is lower, of course, but the overall ratio is 91. It's not too bad. This is low, but not very low. So compared with actually ASEAN plus 1 FTAs, actually we have some additional liberalization over there. But if you look at the contents, actually that breakpoint information is coming from Japanese website, Japanese government website. On the Japan side, actually Japan, Korea, China are connected by RCEP for the first time. And then tariff removal schedule is a little bit complicated. This is actually country by country different tariff schedules are applied over there. So this is unusual. Usually, if you have multiple countries FTA, then one country is imposing same tariffs for other member states. But in case of RCEP, it's not like that. So Japan is having zero tariffs for 86% at the end. Against for China, but for Korea 81, and the other side for Japanese exports, ASEAN member states, Australia, New Zealand are having 86 to 100%, China 86, Korea 83. So this is a little bit unusual, but this is what RCEP is talking about. And I'm talking about here agriculture, forestry, fishery products, and manufactured goods. Manufactured goods, liberalization is there pretty much, but agriculture products, related products, still some protections remain. And those are tariff removal. Then actually, I have a communication with my long-term collaborator, Kazu Hayakawa, IDJ. I have to give him a lot of credit. He's really start comparing tariff schedule between RCEP and ASEAN plus 1 FTAs. Then actually we can certainly Japan, Korea, and also Japan, China are connected by FTAs for the first time. So we have a bunch of liberalizations over there, even if the percentage is not very high. And also actually so CLMV related tariffs, that portion is actually more liberal than ASEAN plus 1 FTA. So we have some additional liberalization, particularly in the CLMV. And also rules of origin. So first, in RCEP, we can utilize accumulation principle much more extensively. At the same time, actually, the details of our rules of origin, that is more liberal than ASEAN plus 1 FTAs. So they obviously negotiated to some extent, and also the liberalization is going to some extent compared with ASEAN plus 1 FTAs. So this is what we would see that for goods. For services, actually, this is a little bit weird, but there's a mixture of countries with positive lists and negative lists. This is unusual, but obviously they are trying to get negative lists. The countries with negative, positive risk are subject to negotiation, they say that. So they are heading for a negative risk approach. I think this is much more liberal than ASEAN +1 FTAs. That's what we see that. And for investment, certainly starting from national treatment, MFN, and also some performance requirements, say prohibition of loyalty regulations and forced technology transfer requirements. And for ISDS and others, negotiation will be continued. So it's said that initiated within 2 years after the agreement is in effect. For ISDS, I know that in many countries having some sort of concern on that. In case of Japan, actually, most of our FTAs and investment treaties, we are already having ISDS. But Japanese are not really using much. If you go to UNCTAD's ISDS homepage, I think they are listing more than 1,000 cases. Only 5 cases are with Japan, actually. Actually, already many countries are using this way. This is really a fair way to do for developing countries or not. I think this is a certainly arguable point. And the Japanese were worrying about ISDS when we talk about TPP. But actually, so this is already cases are accumulated over there. And also, not necessarily investors win, actually. So investors win case, if you look at that, some bizarre cases are there too. Say particularly sudden changes in the policies in local governments, but the central government does not help at all, like that. So I think it's a reality that many cases are accumulated in ISDS. So this is good or not, we can discuss. But from the viewpoint of investors, this channel would give a lot of breathing room. So that's what we have to really look at the cases and whether or not this is reasonable or not, I think. Okay, so I think at level of trade liberalization, this is not 100% satisfactory, of course. This is coming from negotiations. So I think in 5-year review, certainly we have to think of catch up of in liberalization. So CPTPP is set a sort of standard of liberalization level. So maybe not exactly equivalent, but I think it's a more liberalization effort is needed for in review. Okay, next, international rulemaking. RCEP is a big agreement in terms of the number of chapters. So we have 20 chapters, 17 appendices. So the coverage of policy modes is pretty comprehensive. Then actually, if we look at the contents, some are just having a sort of title, but not much ingredients. But some are having some interesting ingredients. So basically, this sets a sort of starting point of future negotiations, possibly in RCEP, possibly in CPTPP, possibly in under WTO. Say once China or ASEAN member states are coming into that kind of rulemaking, how far they can accept those kind of things. So this is a starting point. So interesting things. One is the Chapter 11 in intellectual property. This is a little bit far from TRIPS. So I think some additional things are coming in. This is interesting. Chapter 12, electric commerce. This is very, very interesting. That includes actually free flow of data and no data localization requirement. But subject to public policy, national security, and other considerations. So it's actually, it's not virtually quite effective, I think. But two principles are there, at least in a sort of titles. So I think this is interesting that China accepted these words over there. So I don't think that would change a sort of important domestic laws inside China. But how we can think of the relationship between these kind of commitments and the domestic laws and also enforcement, I think this is a very important thing. And also government procurement there, actually government procurement is not included in many FTAs in East Asia, but finally that is included. The contents are not really much. I think so the transparency cooperation review, but I think this is a starting point for that. So compared with that, CPTPP, certainly government procurement, IPR competition are there. Particularly in IPR, so the US pushed many items over there. When we have a sort of transition from TPP to CPTPP, we had so-called 22 frozen items. Actually, the half of it is related to IPR. So if US is coming back or a sort of accession to CPTPP, then we will negotiate the 22 frozen items, but half of them are related to IPR. And also some novel elements in CPTPP. So one is e-commerce. They have three basic principles, they said. Free flow of data, no data localization requirements, and prohibition of forced disclosure of source codes. So in new NAFTA, USMCA, and others, actually, the last part is a little bit expanded, not just source codes, but the algorithm and others. In Japan, UK, EPA too. But actually, these free flow of data, no data local requirements, those are actually, if we in words at least, in RCEP too. So I think one very important thing is how to enforce those kind of criteria, how domestic laws should be adjusted, and how the enforcement is reviewed. I think those are very, very important. And also SOEs. So this is also talking about the situation of globalization of corporate activities and leveling the playing field. So those are there. Then global agendas, labor, environment are there to some extent. So these are actually, the Biden administration may strengthen so those items if they would come back to East Asia. So we really have to watch very carefully. Then third point, the reducing policy risks. When we make an assessment of RCEP, then how we can utilize RCEP, I think this is very important. Then actually how far RCEP can be utilized as a communication channel with each other. As you know that, say, communication between Japan and Korea is so bad for a long, long time, then actually because of the ASEAN initiative, we can get connected by FTA finally. I think the role of ASEAN was extremely important. From now on, again, if we utilize RCEP as a very effective communication channel, I think the role of ASEAN is very, very important. Then China, of course, they are good trading partners sometimes, but sometimes a bit giving a sort of ad hoc trade policy these days. How far other middle powers can say something to China using as a forum of RCEP. This is challenging, but I think that is one way to utilize RCEP, and in other countries too. So in case of CPTPP, so US walked out, China is not there. So I think that itself is a middle powers coalition actually. Then how to think of middle powers viewpoint on the US-China confrontation. I think this is CPTPP's role. So reducing policy risks, I think this is difficult, but how to utilize Mega-FTAs for reducing policy risks, I think this is a very important point from now on. The last one, forming pro-trade middle power coalition. RCEP actually covers the whole factory Asia. So I think that is a benefit. Benefit is coming, and actually, yeah, in history, rule-based trading regime is really protecting factory Asia. So I think RCEP is not the perfect substitute, of course, but partially rule-based trading regime is there because of RCEP. And India must come back to RCEP for its own reform and also for strengthening our coalition. I think I understand many difficult political issues, particularly with China, and also some Indian scholars are worrying about a trade deficit against China and understand that. But I think it's very important to get connected to ASEAN's initiative. And also, we must avoid the weakening of the coalition by decoupling pressure from both sides. So in case of CPTPP, now the expansion of the membership is the issue. UK already said that they like to come in. So probably this is the first case of accession. So 2021, Japan has a chairmanship of the committee. So actually the details of the procedure of accession is not pre-decided to my understanding. So we have to set the procedure first, but basically all member states should agree on accession. Otherwise, a new country cannot come in. So the US is, UK is the important case. The US, I hope that they will come back to CPTPP or TPP at some point in time, not in the short run probably. But so is it the form of a accession to CPTPP or restart of a TPP or talking about a new agreement? We are not sure. But I think in case of new agreement, particularly if we see the inclination of the Democrats, so actually Democrats put a bunch of things on labor and environment in the renegotiation of NAFTA. So those elements may come. And then China is saying that they are seriously thinking of coming into CPTPP. I think three big hurdles for them, liberalization, SOEs, and e-commerce. So those are pretty tough, I think. But if so reformers inside China are having a sort of power, and if they conduct a really substantial reform, then that may be a good thing, I think. But certainly, those are really tough hurdles over there. But I think from the viewpoint of Chinese, they may think that this is just a matter of negotiation to some extent. Say liberalization, it's actually that Japan is allowed with 95% tariff removal. So this is not very high. And so we really have to watch carefully sort of a high level of liberalization. And also SOEs, so if you look at the TPP, so Malaysia and Vietnam are allowed a lot of exceptions. And also this SOE chapter is really effective on changing domestic things or not. Those kind of monitoring is extremely important. And also e-commerce, again, so TPP's three principles are great, but is it really sort of an enforcement in each country's domestic laws and regulations? that kind of monitoring is extremely important. Otherwise, I think the Chinese side think that this is just a sort of matter of negotiation. I think it's not very good. China is coming in, that's fine, but they have to do a sort of enough reform to do that. So in conclusion, Mega-FTAs must be evaluated in terms of 4 criteria. That's my claim: liberalization, rulemaking, reducing policy risks, and forming a pro-trade middle power coalition. And also, evolving nature of Mega-FTAs must be emphasized. Actually, this is an ASEAN way. ASEAN is a start, sometimes not very high, but step by step, upgrading economic integration. Actually, RCEP should be like that too. And then RCEP upgrading, utilizing as a communication channel, and also supporting Factory Asia are very important. In case of CPTPP, now strengthening the pro-trade coalition is a key. So the East Asia must be more proactive for WTO reform too. I didn't talk about WTO today, but the East Asia was a sort of free trade, free rider for WTO. So we have to be much more serious to support WTO reform from now on. The last page shows references related to my work mostly. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Professor Kimura. Now I will turn to discussant, but before that, let me tell you one thing. Now the viewers can start asking questions. And actually, internet savvy, some of the internet savvy people have already started asking questions, but now everyone can ask questions. And when you ask questions, please use Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And please do not use chat box because we are not taking questions in the chat box. So please use a press Q&A button at the bottom and write whatever you would like to ask. Okay, so let me turn to discussant. We have two discussants today. First one is Professor Disman, who is the chair of the board of directors at the CSIS Foundation in Indonesia. And the other gentleman is Dr. Randawa, who is an adjunct senior fellow at the RSIS in Singapore. So first, let me invite Professor Disman for comments. And we are running a little late, so please keep it to 7 minutes. Professor Disman, please.
Thank you very much, Narushige-san. Good morning. Good morning to Kimura-san. We haven't seen each other for a long time now. Good morning also to Tanaka-san from RIPS. Likewise, we haven't seen each other for a long time. We have been somewhat disconnected lately. I thank Professor Kimura for the very comprehensive discussion of RCEP. I take this kind of discussion as kind of prelude to more deeper discussions that we need in the future on RCEP. As Kimura-san emphasized, we need to see the current RCEP agreement as a living agreement. It still leaves so many things to be desired, to be negotiated, of which a plethora of very difficult issues are waiting for us to discuss. I prepare one slide and I would like to base my 7-minute discussion on this. And I will be going very quickly through this slide. Number one, it is very important, yes, to underline that the signing of RCEP agreement at this time is a kind of a very encouraging sign And even though it is an oasis, it is a very big oasis, as discussed in many analyses on RCEP. RCEP is a huge region, and it has the potential actually to leverage what it has to push progress forward in the investment and trading environment. But the increment brought about by RCEP is actually limited. To me, the most meaningful contribution or offset is that it brings China, Japan, and Korea together in one agreement. This is historical to me. And I wish to see this relationship flourishing in the years to come. But as Kimura-san discussed, in the relationship within RCEP between these three countries, many things are left to be desired. The level of liberalization is still under expectation. Point number 3, RCEP, I think, is kind of enabling condition to revitalize global and regional value chains. I fully agree with Kimura-san. Global value chain has not died. It will return, and I hope it will return with new figures. And we know that within East Asia, we have so many growth centers. Some are called growth centers, such as Sijori. Some are called special economic zones. Some are called free trade zones. And I hope that under RCEP, these centers will be growing faster than they have been so far. I think given the difficulties involved in dealing with openness, relying on these growth centers, insulated centers, I think is a proper strategy for the near future. So RCEP as enabling condition for them to grow faster. Point number 4, subdued announcement effect. People hardly noticed the signing of RCEP, and that's understandable given the pandemic. And this is likely to be the case at least in the next 2 years. In the next 2 years, we are going to have to deal with the health issues related to COVID-19, the huge stimulus that government has to put in place, exit from the huge stimulus that is going to be imperative in a not too distant future, and also what is called scars of crisis. Because of this crisis, we are going to see output potential reduced in the immediate years unless we come up with very strong reform initiative. And RCEP, I think, is one possible venues to push forward these reforms. We should not underestimate these crisis-related scars, the decline in long-term output trend. Point number 5, as usual, regional trade agreements are meticulous in dealing with tariff issues. The same applies to RCEP, but they are not able to do so in dealing with difficult issues. Even issues as simple as non-tariff measures in trade and investment. Yeah? We are dealing with it more intensively lately, but coming to a binding agreement is going to be very hard. And beyond that, of course, abusive practices of IPR protection, data traffic. Kimura-san mentioned this in his presentation. How do we live under the so-called surveillance capitalism, surveillance market? How do we deal with traffic data? Of course, there is provision under RCEP on this, but we are yet to come up to a binding agreement on it. And one more thing, equalization measures. When we dealt with EAFTA in the past, we placed this as one of the core measures that are needed in any East Asian free trade agreements. And RTAs, I think apart from the European Union, RTAs have not dealt satisfactorily with this. In the case of European Union, they have sectoral schemes as well as regional schemes. And as discussed by Kimura-san, RCEP is overshadowed by CPTPP. And sooner or later, I think we have to deal with consolidated East Asian regionalism. Consolidated East Asian regionalism, whether it is going to be in form of FTAAP or an East Asian agreement confined to East Asia is an issue that we have to deal with soon. Another important point, the spirit of regionalism.
Professor Disman, I'm sorry, but we are running late, so...
Well, 2 more minutes. I think,
okay,
as underlined by Kimura-san, trade agreement is not an end in itself. It is meant as instrument of peace. And RCEP should also serve what Kimura-san called instrument of communication between members, particularly among the CJK. Lastly, Indonesia. Indonesia should elevate this RCEP as a new opportunity to rediscover openness, to rediscover our place in East Asia, which we have never really defined well. And of course, to connect to the rest of East Asia in a more meaningful way as we have done so far. This should be an opportunity for us to get business people, government people, central and local governments to engage again in issues related to trade, export orientation, foreign direct investment, human capital accumulation, etc. We should not leave this opportunity untapped. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. Let me move to Dr. Randawa for comments. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Professor Michishita. And it's indeed a pleasure for me to comment on Professor Kimura's very comprehensive and nuanced presentation. In the comments, I echo some of the points that have already been raised by Professor Jisman, so I won't repeat that. But just to quickly summarize, so against the backdrop of 3 very destabilizing developments, the steady weakening of the rules-based multilateral system, the US-China trade dispute, and the debilitating effects of the pandemic, Professor Kimura has offered a very nuanced and informative analysis of how the principles underlying RCEP could enable middle power countries to boost economic integration across East and Northeast Southeast Asia, and perhaps hopefully at some point in the future, South Asia. What's really notable are the tangible proposals to generate momentum for boosting integration, drawing on the principles he's fleshed out of liberalization, rulemaking, reducing policy risk, which is critical in these days, through the formation of a pro-trade middle power coalition, of which we are all residents here. So these are the principles on which I would like to expand and highlight the opportunities that I believe lie ahead for ASEAN and Japan, and perhaps also, if I'm not engaging in wishful thinking, provide the momentum and just to boost discussions on revival of the now moribund TPP in the form of the CPTPP. So what does RCEP do? It of course consolidates existing FTAs, and the prospects are limited on that count. But as has been mentioned, by bringing together such a diverse set of countries, it substantially boosts opportunities for trade and with all the other beneficial effects. Most significantly, as Professor Kimura pointed out, it lends clarity to the rules of origin through simplifications now that are far more generous and straightforward than other FTAs. And this makes it easier to use ASEAN as a production base and attracting FDI. I won't elaborate on the coverage. It's breathtaking indeed for the size of the global population, GDP, and the nearly $10 trillion and a quarter of total global foreign direct investment it draws. But what's pertinent out here is ASEAN's centrality in the design and execution of the agreement in bringing very diverse regions together and creating an FTA that goes well beyond the provisions of the WTO and discovered new ground on e-commerce, intellectual property rights, some of the role of SOEs, hopefully, and of course, government procurement. And this at a time when many are shutting borders. So RCEP sends a strong signal, and that's what Professor Kimura also spoke of, a strong signal to the global economy that ASEAN and its partners in RCEP are indeed open for business. And it bears repetition that this is the second most integrated region after the EU, with strong trade relations with all regions of the world, including the EU, North Asia's, North America, of course, Oceania, and the growing links with Latin America and Africa as well. So I'm going to take the liberty of extending Professor Kimura's analysis to examine the possibilities for ASEAN in collaboration with Japan. And the three areas that suggest themselves, three areas that will help to boost productivity. Firstly, preparing for the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. Some of these already manifest in factories and service sector firms across the region in a piecemeal manner. And what's needed out here is a greater state commitment for investments, not just in technology, in skills development, networks, and also assessing the very vital issue of the impact this may have on employment. And then investments in green technology. ASEAN states are amongst some of the most vulnerable regions in the world, vulnerable to climate change. And the third, which tends to be neglected frequently, is services trade, including digital trade, where ASEAN continues to be fairly protectionist, and I think there's a great understated potential for boosting output and productivity. So at a practical level, this is going to call for two major steps. The first of which we hear very often, and that's digitization, including boosting regional network connectivity, assistance to SMEs, and very importantly, in this part of the world, very concerted efforts to bridge the digital divide and impart digital literacy at the grassroots, skill development programs again, and there's much that can be done in collaboration with Japan. I know JICA and JETRO are both already very active in this domain. The second is a relatively unheralded area, and that's policy coordination, where there's, I believe, tremendous need and scope. Something that's already underway, but this calls for a level of coordination which is several notches above what ASEAN has achieved in the past. And if anything, I think the pandemic has underscored the importance of close collaboration amongst ASEAN members. And we have looming in the immediate future the existential threat posed by climate change, and ASEAN is amongst the more vulnerable regions of the world with specific exposure to extreme heat and levels of humidity. There are a number of risks that need to be addressed domestically and in collaboration. The pandemic has threatened to reverse a number of economic, social, and development gains made over the past few decades, widening the gap between haves and have-nots. So the unprecedented disruptions that we've seen to global trade and the synchronized demand, which Professor Kimura alluded to in global demand, could reinforce the trend towards deglobalization. Yeah. And that's where one needs to be wary, and that's where there's a strong signal, as Professor Kimura alluded, to potential liberalizers in the future. So in these conditions, I think it's important to reassess development paths, by seizing new opportunities through deeper regional cooperation and integration that would help drive more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable growth. A quick point on geopolitics. Notwithstanding a sharp deterioration in relation between the US and China, I think there are limits to the extent of decoupling that can take place. There's too much at stake for both countries. Most US multinationals investing in China are catering to the domestic market in China, and this is going to be growing. Likewise, China's dependency on exports, despite the new change allowance, is still very much dependent on exports, including technology exports. So I imagine, notwithstanding dramatic decline in political relations, the changes are likely to be gradual. So looking ahead, and I'll come to the last part, Asia Pacific was the growth pole that helped to pull the global economy out of the last financial crisis, the global financial crisis. However, things are different today. Growth across the region is very damp, is low, it's subdued. Yesterday, there was a write-up with Standard & Poor's talking about the impact this may have on revival prospects. Just quickly wrapping up, the trend towards Mega-FTAs pointed out by Professor Kimura has a history that dates back to the slowdown in multilateral pacts after the Doha round of talks until 2007, 2008, when the enthusiasm for trade deals started waning, and that's clearly pointed out. And the resistance towards trade liberalization, if anything, has gathered steam following increasing inequality across the world, and particularly falling incomes amongst the labor class in developed economies, where the strongest base for the Trumps and the Orbans and others comes from. And the ILO data, in fact, on this is fairly sobering as well. And this is what leads to the increased emphasis and the quest.
Can we leave it there? For the sake of time, we have to take questions from the people.
Can I just wrap up with a quick sentence, if I may? So what I just wanted to say was this provides a very useful counterexample to the regressive global trends that are underway. And as Professor Kimura pointed out, the evolving nature of Mega-FTAs, it does offer a very hopeful and sustainable channel to revival of multilateralism. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me just take questions now. So I will take two questions from the panelists on the screen. and 2 questions from the viewer. So if any of you on the screen, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. No question at this point? Oh, okay. Oh, Dr. Lee, please go ahead. Unmute yourself and...
Okay, can you hear me well? Yeah, thank you very much for the insightful presentations. Since we are running out of time, I'm gonna make my questions quick. I have 2 questions. One of them is, I think economists have long debated about the consequences of a regional trade agreement. And then some of them believe that they could serve as a stumbling blocks for multilateral liberalization, because basically RTA are providing some kind of a discriminatory mechanism, which is giving priorities to insiders at the expense of the others. So I wonder how such criticisms will be applied to the case of the RCEP. And then the second question is, I was wondering what you think about the consequences of the proliferation of the RTAs, including CPTPP and an RCEP, on the existing WTO system. Because I guess there are some concerns about the tensions between these multi-layers of the trading systems. So I'm gonna stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Is there anybody else on the screen who would like to ask questions? Okay, if not, let me ask Professor Kimura to respond.
Yeah, so I think how to think of RTAs, I think we have, still among economists, we have a sort of different views over there. But in the past 10, 15 years, we thought that particularly in case of FTAs rather than customs unions, so overlapping FTAs do not harm us much. Actually, private sector will choose the most advantageous agreement, actually, preferential agreements. So I think we had a sort of a psychological break over there that it's okay to set up a sort of overlapped FTAs. Spaghetti ball, noodle ball effects, of course, complicates the system of trade policy, but it doesn't really hurt the trade flows. So if we have a better agreement, then even if it's overlapped, and that would be good. So I think that one thing over there. And also in case of Mega-FTAs, a sort of third countries' concern is a bit different from bilateral FTAs. Bilateral FTAs are advantageous only for 2 countries in a sense, intentionally. But in case of Mega-FTAs, particularly with seeking of some sort of accessions and the expansion of the membership, I think the implication will be quite different. And the WTO would work, then that's fine. But liberalization under WTO doesn't move. And also the new rule making is very, very difficult over there too. Of course, we have to continue working on that, but we cannot wait because economies are really changing, globalizing. So that's why we have to utilize Mega-FTAs. So that's a sort of a thing that we start thinking. 20 years ago, many economists are against RTAs. But now this is a reality. We really have to utilize that in a kind of a good ways. So that's what we start thinking of among economists, economist society, I think. Right. That's my quick answer. Right.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Kimura. So let me take one question from the viewers. And let me actually share it with you in the chat box. So the question is, let me read it. To what extent is CPTPP truly an insulation for metal powers, as this was not the initial idea of it? Why do you think that the US will not return in the short run? Will the US come back to the TPP in the long term? So that's the question to Professor Kimura.
Thank you. Good questions. The first one, I think that TPP cannot insulate sort of pressure coming from the US and China 100%. So if you look at Mexico and Canada, they are really getting a lot of pressure from the US all the way. We cannot insulate that kind of pressure. But at least among middle powers, we can keep a sort of rule-based trading regime to some extent. And also, possibly we could say something on the worldwide trading regime should be pro-trade. I think that's probably we can do to some extent in CPTPP. So by chance, we lost the US. So that's actually the genuine grouping of middle powers, actually. Maybe not intentionally from the beginning. But I think it's, in a sense, very important forum. Then the accession of UK is an interesting thing because UK is finally coming into Asia-Pacific country. I don't know why, but I think the pro-trade coalition may be strengthened by having the UK. That kind of characteristics may be strengthened. And the US may not return quickly because I think a TPP has a really bad image in Washington, D.C. politics. So many people think that in the short run, probably the US cannot really think of international commercial policies very seriously. So probably that's true, I think. But if they are rational, then I think they have to have a better connection to Asia Pacific, definitely. So I think it's rational for the US to come back to TPP. But coming back to a sort of original TPP or not, I'm not quite sure because say in NAFTA renegotiation, the Democrats put a lot of things related to, say, labor and environment, for example. They like to add those kind of elements in Asia-Pacific agreement too. Then certainly we have to do negotiation, signing, ratification process again. So that may take time. So I don't know what would happen, but Asia-Pacific is a growing region. So certainly if the US is rational, they should come back.
Okay, thank you very much. So actually, let me ask two questions. One is about India. So India decided not to join the RCEP. But what do you think about in the possibility of India participating or coming back, joining in RCEP in the future? And if India cannot come back, how about Japan deciding to sign a bilateral free trade agreement with India? So that's the first question.
Actually,
second,
yeah, okay, go ahead.
Second question is about China. So China has expressed its willingness to join the TPP. So how might the US new administration react to this Chinese initiative or, kind of overture? And do you think it's possible for China to join the TPP before the United States of America?
Right. The first question, the possibility of India to come back, and maybe Dr. Randawa would answer on that, I guess. But I think India is not really coming into East Asian factory Asia yet. So India has a pretty strong engineering sector, and certainly they have to be coming into task by task division of labor, but actually not. So I think but still, yeah, of course, and software industry and others are very, very important. So we have different kinds of international division of labor emerging, but still, I think India needs the strong manufacturing sector too, because that generates a lot of employment, particularly relatively poor people can work in manufacturing and also related services industries. So I think that makes sense for India to come into production networks in ASEAN and East Asia. And still the link is very, very thin. So certainly already we have ASEAN-India FTA, but the quality is not very, very high. So I think by RCEP, some investment climate will be improved on the Indian side and also the connection with ASEAN. I think that would change the competitiveness of manufacturing sector in India. So particularly in the machinery industry is actually not just imports, but we are importing and exporting at the same time. That is different from a traditional manufacturing sector like textile and garment. Textile and garment, one-way trade, but in machinery industry, two-way trade actually. So I think that kind of aspect should be understood by Indian policymakers. By the way, so Japan-India has FTA already, okay, but not. Maybe we can upgrade the sort of contents to some extent. The China's possible accession to TPP and the US reaction. US may not be very comfortable, of course. And so I think that would put some pressure for the US to think about TPP more seriously, definitely. If China is coming in first, then US is coming back, then actually all member states should agree on new accession. So the US is tested by China. That's probably they don't want to see. So I think that kind of notion from the side of China would stimulate the US to think about Asia much more seriously. Did I answer your question? I think.
Yes. Thank you so much. So it's time to wrap up. So we have learned how we are moving forward slowly but steadily in terms of getting into or creating free trade agreements in the region. So this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube later. So if any of your friends or colleagues was not able to join us today, please let them know about that. Thank you very much, Professor Kimura, for the excellent presentation and the kind answers to our questions. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Goodbye and see you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.